Well, welcome back to the channel. Today, I am going to talk about the definition of politics. The definition of politics. I'm going to begin a series in which I talk about the different topics that would fall under the discipline of politics. And so, the first topic or the first question we should ask is, what is the definition of politics? Now, when you think of a definition, I'll get to the distinctions in a moment, but we think of, well, when we define something, we're getting down to what that thing is. That's really what it comes down to. When someone says, well, what's your definition of this or that? Or what's your definition of Christian nationalism? They're asking for, well, what do you mean by the term when you use it? So what do we mean by politics? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today with the help of some reformed guys. You might have heard they're long dead, but long in glory. And so these guys are going to help me out. The first thing I wanted to mention, it's the question of the definition of politics. I'll never forget, I was in grad school, maybe second or third year in grad school, and I had a professor. I didn't really particularly like the professor. But he had, we're all grad students, we're sitting in class, think we're smart and all that. Look at us, we're going to get our PhDs or masters or something. And in the end, this guy asked us straight up. He said, "Well, so what's the definition of politics?" And most people in the room just were dead silent. So here are these people who have an undergraduate degree. They're getting a graduate degree in politics, and they're struggling to give a good definition of politics. And I'll never forget that. Me, of course, I had read Althusius very closely, at least the first page at that point. And so I said it's the art of associating men for commodious life or something to that effect. So I answered the question, which annoyed him because he was a Marxist and I wasn't, and I badgered him throughout the class. But anyway, so I'll never forget that even academics, when they talk about politics, they devote their entire life to the study of politics, and they really don't know precisely what they're defining. Now, there's reasons for that because they focus on subdisciplines and all that. But it's really important that if we're going to talk about politics generally, we need to actually define it. Now, once we define politics, I will then define what I mean by Christian politics. I think you can build from there. So the way I want to approach this is to go essentially talk into three steps here. So the first step is going to be, what is antecedent to politics? So I think if we want to understand broadly what is politics, we have to understand what is antecedent, or what is prior, kind of logically, prior to what is more formally politics. So you have what's antecedent, prior to it, and then you have what politics is kind of in its essence in form. So you could say antecedent and then form. And the third one would be what politics is in a consequential sense, or in consequence. In consequence of what politics is, what does that mean in the world? So antecedent to politics, what politics is formally, and then what politics is consequently. So those are the three I'm going to talk about. So let's first talk about what politics is antecedently. So what is, in a sense, prior to politics? What's prior to politics is the fact that we are human beings. We are created by God with a certain sociality, a certain social life, principles of social being, whatever you want to call it. And I've often used this. I think I used it in my book, Case for Christian Nationalism, that you can conceive of, and we can witness in the world different forms of social life. So you can take bears. My understanding is that most bears are more solitary beings. I'm sure that of course they have relations with each other in some sense, but they are solitary beings. They spend their time mainly alone, and so that would be, and that's not bad. It's actually good for bears because that's part of their nature to kind of be solitary beings. Now, you also have you have the carpenter bees or the wood bees, those bees that kind of drill into your deck or into wood or whatever, the fence you built. I have to deal with this actually, carpenter bees apparently scare off wasps. So I'd rather have carpenter bees, but anyway, trade-offs, right? They're solitary beings. Those fat bees that almost run into you and stare at you. They're solitary. But opposite to that, you have honeybees. Honeybees are highly communal creatures, and they have to be necessarily. If they stop being that, they would all die because they need each other. But they're highly collectivist, but lack individuality. The same would be true of ants. So ants themselves are in colonies, and they exist as a group, and they would not survive without it. Now, human beings are something in between that, or you could say they have both individuality and they have a collective life. So we affirm everyone's individuality in various ways. One key one would be in vocation. So you've learned to be a podcaster or a YouTuber, or more realistically, you've learned to be a carpenter, you learned to be a welder, you learned to be an engineer, or a pastor. You have these various vocations, and so there's even in that there's individuality. All right, so we praise the carpenter who's kind of got this ingenious form of carpentry. But once they become masters, then they can actually contribute to the profession in a broader sense. And we praise that and all that. So there's individual side, but the reason why we can master things as individuals is that we have to live in a society, right? We live in a society in which I don't have to focus on farming all day to feed myself and my family. Right? So I don't have to do any of that. I can focus on this. You can think of even a medieval village where you have carpenters, and you have the blacksmith, and you have the grocer, and you have the farm. You have all these different people fulfilling their different vocations. And the only reason, again, someone can develop mastery in a particular vocation is because other people around them are also developing mastery in a particular vocation. So for that reason, in a way, our individuality and our sort of communal life are intertwined. We can't live well alone, and so we are drawn to others by our nature. So this is not just a purely intellectual, rational thing that we kind of think, I guess it would be better if we were around others. No, we actually instinctively want to be around others. Even when we live out in the country like myself, we still want to be able to interact and exchange goods and services with people around us. So we are both individual and collective. And one of the problems in the world, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the issues is that how do you balance, or how do you affirm both that social nature and that highly individual nature without one kind of tipping over and destroying the other? And I think we're facing weird dynamics there to this day, today. But so with that in mind, what it means then is we're individuals who need society. And that means there has to be a social organization. There's a coming together of different people, of individuals and families seeking after their good. Okay? And in doing so, they also desire to seek out the good of neighbor as well. So therefore, we have a group of people together, people of different interests, of different vocations, of people of different skills and knowledge levels and all these things. And so this raises the question of politics. This raises the question of how are we going to arrange that society? How are we going to organize, and what rules and laws are we going to use to govern ourselves? And this raises the question of the political. So in other words, we need to coordinate our activities. So let's not think about sin in a moment. Let's not think about law as restraining sin. Let's think about law as coordinating activity, like traffic laws help you coordinate driving around on the road. Those kinds of things. You want to make sure if someone wants to build a dam in a creek so they can use it for fishing or a water source, that they are not affecting people negatively 10 miles down the road into the river or the creek or whatever. So we have these problems. So you need an overarching governing authority to manage those different interests, not necessarily to restrain sin. And so that kind of gets at what is antecedent to politics, that our human nature itself requires there to be some kind of governing rule-based system that would regulate our life in common together for our good. Okay, so that's the antecedent element of politics. You could also talk about antecedent as in, well, how does that come to form? How do people come together in agreement? Is consent part of that? Is there a state of nature? There's all these questions that I want to talk about later. But I think broadly speaking, without getting into too many specifics, we can say that we have a social nature, we need others, and then the questions of political life, of questions of the city, of the polis, of how we're going to arrange ourselves as a collective life then comes up. These things arise from the antecedent nature. All right, so then that's the antecedent side. Now let's talk about what it would be formally in a form. What is formally, and this kind of gets at the exact definition of politics. So when we think of definitions, we typically we kind of throw out what we think something is, or we talk about things in a way that describes characteristics of something without often getting down to exactly what that thing is, without getting down to its essence. So in politics, someone might say, like, politics is where you have congressmen and they talk and they deliberate, something like that. Politics is where you fight with others to gain power. Okay, so all those things are elements of politics. They're attributes, they're properties of politics, you can say, but those don't get at the actual essence of what politics is. And luckily, we have people who have thought about it for a long time. In the Christian tradition, the reflection on politics in terms of definition, it kind of, I don't want to say it started, but it's really it's the reference point for a lot of people later on in the tradition was Augustine's discussion of Cicero. Now, Cicero's, a couple of Cicero, well, several, but the most important ones on the laws is one of them that Cicero wrote. He's a Roman orator, lawyer, politician, senator. They were lost, so the only access we had was essentially through Augustine. And there was great, but they were later discovered, I believe, in the 19th century. So we have kind of imperfect copies of these dialogues that Cicero wrote, but in them, Augustine essentially takes Cicero's definition. He kind of in City of God, Augustine essentially turns it on his head, essentially to argue that Rome, in fact, was not glorious and just because it failed to recognize the true God, and that was one reason why Augustine said that it fell to the barbarians. And so what Augustine says, again, following Cicero, is the republic is the affair of the people. Okay, that's one line. He's essentially saying the people are not just any assembly of a multitude. So it's not just a group of people together. It's an assembly united by a consensus of law and a communion of interests. So much so that the civil polity is, on the whole, the way of life of the people. Now that's actually Lambert Deneau's summary of Augustine's, essentially taking from Cicero. But that's the idea. So it's a consensus, a united consensus around law and of common interest. So much so that you can say that the civil polity, or politics in lived out, is the way of life of the people. Bios demo. That's Greek. Okay? Or as that is the way of life of the entire people. Okay? So that is what, that's also what, well, let's keep going. So Lambert Deneau, this is recently translated and should be out probably the next few months, hopefully. This is from his book, Christian Politics. He says, polity is a publicly sanctioned, honorable way of life and acting, which some entire assembly chooses for itself for a just reason and subsequently enacts through good laws. Okay, that is the honorable way of life, living and acting with some entire, with an assembly choosing for itself the just laws Okay, so that's the idea. The emphasis within the Augustinian tradition is largely on this consensus of law. Okay, it's that it's a multitude of people with a consensus of law. Now, the classic traditional view of law is it's far more extensive, even into the things we would call customs and traditions. So if you look at the old Greek laws from Sparta and from Athens, laws would go into things that we would find cultural. And a lot of times the difference between law and custom is actually kind of blurred. And so it's not always clear exactly what we're referring to. Sometimes they're kind of the same thing. And so this is why when you see laws, you shouldn't think of sort of facilitating activity, or not only facilitating activity, but actually referring to more than that, referring to kind of a way of life. So that the traditions that you're required to participate in. So that's kind of the Augustinian tradition that's reflected that's rooted in Cicero through Augustine throughout the tradition. And I think that is actually, everyone basically accepts that, but it's, I would argue, a not utterly complete definition. And I'd say that a more complete definition of politics is actually described by Althusius. And let me pull up this. Let me pull this up here. Yeah, so here is Althusius's definition of politics. This is from Politica. I got it right here. He says, politics is the art of associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. All right, so the first thing is associating is actually a word, consociandi. And this translation for a long time was actually criticized for using the word association instead of consociation, which is actually a real English word. But anyway, the idea here is it's politics, the art of associating men. Okay, so that would be, we'll get into more detailed definition that he has later. But it's the idea that it's a sort of art. It's not simply a science. It's a type of art of associating or consociating, meaning bringing people together for a certain purpose, for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. So, in this sense, the social life, it's as if politics is a type of act. It establishes, but also kind of acts upon the society to help to facilitate and regulate the associating, the consociating. That is the interaction between the people. Okay, and so let's go into the more detailed laws that he has. This is later on. Let's see, I think it's in 29 or so. 29. Yeah, so we're going to focus on this paragraph here. All right, so he says the first one is efficient cause, but look at formal cause right here. Formal cause, the second line down from section 29 there. Let's start with that one. The formal cause is indeed the association brought about by contributing and communicating one with the other, in which political men institute, cultivate, maintain, and conserve the fellowship of human life through decisions about those things useful and necessary to this social life. All right, so when you think of a classical definition, we don't do this very often. I try to do this in my book, Case for Christian Nationalism. In a classical definition, it would include these four causes: the formal, material, efficient, and final. And so if you get those four right and you put that in a definition, then you've really hit what that thing is in its essence. So the formal cause is kind of what it broadly is. You can kind of think of it as like a genus and species, the way you can classify it. And so in this sense, he says it's association of men brought about by contributing and communicating to one another. Now, what's different about this than the Augustinian tradition, to my knowledge, is that one emphasizes law, which we'll get to in a second. But this one is about how the people have us in social life. It's a matter of exchanging different things. Now, this goes from everything to exchanging in your vocation, so that you have a skill, you exchange with someone else with a different skill for some good that you that you both want, or goods that you both want. This could also mean conversation. This could be music and arts, the things that you share together. All right, so you're contributing different things that you can do as a society. It's an emphasis upon how the individual relates to the group and how the group relates to the individual. So when you see contributing and communicating is not simply language, but it's the art of it. It's exchanging goods and services and these other things. Communing, meaning you are communicating your skills into society. Okay. So contributing and communicating one with the other, in which political men institute, cultivate, maintain, and conserve the fellowship of human life through decisions about those things useful and necessary to the social life. So that's the element of, so in that definition, in the formal cause, it contains both the social life of contributing and communing, but then also the governing body acting upon that society to regulate that life, to cultivate, maintain, and conserve. So instituting, let's go through these words. Instituting would be the idea of actually kind of establishing. But also cultivating. Cultivating is a sense in which you're making it better. We tend to think of politics nowadays as either maintaining and conserving. I think essentially conservatives do this, I think, a lot, and I think it's to our I think it's poor, it's bad that we do this, that we don't actually have a sense of cultivating. So where I live out in the country, everyone here is a conservative. Everyone's interested in maintaining the status quo. We don't want, building projects and all this, but there's not a sense in which we should cultivate this space. And so basically people come here to kind of get away. And someone like me would like to contribute to, would like to shape this place to cultivate it, like have a, Little League baseball field down the road or something like that. But that's the idea. You want to see what would actually be good beyond simply maintaining and conserving. But of course, maintaining and conserving is part of the duty of government as well. That's kind of self-explanatory. But what are they doing? They're conserving the fellowship of human life. The fellowship of human life. They're not maintaining simply the individual, but they're maintaining the fellowship of that individual with another individual, such that they have a collective life together. And in fact, the earlier on from that first definition, he used the word symbiosis, which is the idea that life together. We're doing life together. Sounds like an evangelical phrase, but that's what it is. That's what politics is. It's not simply you being an individual out in the woods and people stay away from you and you enter society when you want. No, it actually is a life together. It's a symbiosis. And it's a sort of organic life on its own. We can think of a society as a type of organic unit with different parts. Just think of the parts of your body and how they contribute different things to an overall whole, to a whole. You have parts to a whole. We tend today not to think of politics as precisely that, as having a holistic thing. We don't think of ourselves as a contribution, that someone that contributes to a whole and is kind of fundamental to that. In fact, one of the criticisms I got from John Wellesley of my book was that I'm following a Hegelian tradition and thinking of society in a more holistic way. In fact, I wasn't following Hegel, I was following just Malthusius. So I'm following that tradition, which is, and I would say that the tradition of viewing society as a organic whole is in Augustine, it's in Cicero, it's in Plato, of course, and certainly in Aristotle. And it's just good politics. And it's actually, even if you deny or try to fight against the organic nature of society, if society is actually working and it's doing well, it's because, at least fundamentally, if you don't see it, it's working organically. That is, each part is balancing the other. Each part is necessary to the whole, just like your various ligaments and your organs and your features. All those things contribute to you having a healthy body. And without any of them, things will go out of balance and actually harms the whole. I think we've all, if you sometimes people who hurt their ankles, for example, they start walking around, but now that they have a limp, what happens? Now they hurt their back. So these things tend to compound. That's an analogy for society. If one area of society is doing poorly, it tends to get around and affect the rest of it as well. All right, so that's the formal cause. You can think of that as typically in a definition, that would be the first thing you see. It really is the what, like the whatness of what politics is. The next one, let's go up just the first line there. The efficient cause of political association is consent and agreement among the communicating citizens. So an efficient cause is essentially what brings something about. It's the origin. It can be the origin of something and or what maintains it. In this case, it would be both. It would be the, at least in a logical sense, it would be both the origin and what maintains it. It is consent and agreement among the communicating citizens. That is, people within society are agreeing to it, the laws, and they have a common interest, and consent is a big subject in politics, and I think like Christians don't realize nowadays. I've been surprised at how many people kind of argue against consent, partly because they think it's an Enlightenment doctrine, when it's really not. Like the idea of consent is again, it's in the definition. He didn't say consent explicitly, but it's in the definition from Augustine. It's in Cicero. It's in essentially it's in Aquinas. It's a very basic position, and I don't want to I'll get into that some other time. But it's that people essentially agree to live here. Now you might say I've never actually given my consent, and traditionally people will say that something called tacit consent is legitimate. Tacit consent meaning that, well, you've participated, you've benefited from, and that constitutes a type of consent. Okay. Practically speaking, you could say that if people are not revolting in the streets, then they're essentially giving their consent. I don't want to get too much into that, but that is a basic. Yeah. Another thing, like in politics today, we would talk about consent in relation to legitimacy. So they're not exactly the same thing. But if you don't have, like, if people do not consider the government legitimate, and they act in light of that, then they're essentially declaring their non-consent. Okay. All right, the next thing is the final cause. The final cause is basically the purpose of it. What's the actual reason for it? Final cause of politics is the enjoyment of a comfortable, useful, and happy life, and of the common welfare. Okay, so that we may live with piety and honor, a peaceful and quiet life, that while true piety towards God, justice among the citizens may prevail at home, defense against the enemies from abroad may be maintained, and that concord and peace may always and everywhere thrive. Okay, it's also, you can have more than one final cause, is also the conservation of a human society that aims at a life in which you can worship God quietly and without error. Okay, this is where we'll get into the Christian stuff a little bit later. So this is the purpose. So what's the purpose of contributing and communicating? What's the purpose of making decisions? Are we just doing this out of just divine command? It doesn't matter, like there's no reason behind it. What's the purpose for it? No, it's the conservation of human society. It's the enjoyment of a comfortable, useful, and happy life. So that's why people get together, because they know they can't live well by themselves or live well alone. And so what do? They need to come together to live well. To live well, you need to live with others and have a life regulated together that reaches that. And this is one indicator, a crucial indicator, that your society is not really working, that your symbiosis is actually not a symbiosis at all. And that is, if the city or the people are unhappy, if what they're not getting what is useful, if they do not lead comfortable lives in general, if the common welfare is not cared for, and even in this last one, if you cannot worship God quietly and without error. Okay, so if none of those things are present, or if one or more are not present, then that's cause for concern. That's kind of the sort of litmus test of whether or not you are under a just government. All right. So that's the final cause. It's a purpose. And then, so the last one is the material of politics. Now, material is kind of like the stuff of politics. That is the, like, what does it mean? So it says, the formal cause is like cultivating, maintaining decisions of things useful for necessary life. The material politics are the actual precepts or laws and customs for communicating those things, right? So you have a social life, you have a governing body that's making decisions about this social life. So the actual stuff of politics is going to be the things, the services, the actual actions that you take in society. It's going to be the actual acts of communicating and contributing. It's going to be the actual acts of making law, of obeying customs. So just like when I say in my definition of Christian nationalism, I say that in the formal sense, it's a totality of national action. So it's not just a bunch of disparate things that we do. It's actually united in a whole. And that whole is for the purpose of seeking or acquiring or procuring earthly and heavenly good. That's the final cause. The material cause are the actual laws and customs of that society. Like, so those dictate actions. So when a law essentially says do this or don't, and do this or don't do that. Customs basically say the same thing, do this and don't do that. And so they kind of govern the way we act in the world. Those are the things those are the actions. When I say the totality of national action, the totality part is really the formal cause, in the sense that those actions, when combined, lead to society seeking after their complete good, which is both earthly and heavenly. All right, so that's where I get my definition. Is from the four causes. And the efficient cause is that it's a people acting for their good. So the efficient, or the origin of Christian nationalism, are the people seeing themselves as a Christian, or as a Christian people, and then acting for their good, or seeking to act for their good. All right, so now if we want to think, so what's the definition of politics? We could think of it as politics as sort of association of contributing and communicating. Okay, it's formal, brought about by the consent and agreement among these communicating citizens, in order to procure for itself a comfortable, useful, and happy life, and also pious life, and also to seek the common welfare, by establishing precepts and services and rights and privileges in society to bring about that symbiosis and common advantage of social life. Okay, so that's, so I guess I think of it more simply. It's a society that has come together, that will communicate and contribute. Individuals will then contribute to the whole and then receive benefits from the whole. It's formed by the consent and agreement of the people, and it is and the purpose is that they would individually and collectively live a useful, happy life in peace and godliness. And this would be by means of them establishing laws and customs and a way of life. So that's the definition of politics. And I think that's a pretty good definition of politics. Again, it's so far again, we've talked mainly about the man as man. And it's a matter of human nature. That's why these things form across all over the world, is that people know they need each other, then they know they need precepts, and they need customs and traditions that would unite them as a people. Again, it's not just, as we saw from the Augustine definition. Political society is not simply a multitude of people. It's a multitude of people with consent to a common laws and common interests. And then, of course, the more expanded definition that I just talked about right there. So lastly, we talked about what's antecedent to politics. We talked about what is politics in a formal way. Now, what is politics in a consequential way, or in consequence of all that? Well, that means you need then to people to do politics. So in consequence of this need for this thing called politics, you need people to do politics. You need people to learn and master that art. You need people to talk about it. You need people to deliberate on it. And so that means you need, let's call them politicians, or better, we can call them statesmen, or we can call them princes, or whatever, magistrates, or rulers, or whatever. So then in consequence of politics, you need politicians, or you need statesmen. And they're the ones who will then deliberate upon it and form a, form and enact the laws that are for our good. All right, so that would be one element of it. Now let's introduce sin in the equation. So now that there's sin, politics is still fundamentally the same, but it's been augmented with this need to restrain sin, right? And so so then now politics includes determining which vices are in society, which are very destructive, and which ones need to be seriously undermined and suppressed, and which can be. And can you, like, the question of deliberation would be, can we actually effectively destroy this vice in society? So that would be one thing. The other thing is politics. Now you have enemies. Now you have people who will act in society in ways you believe would be destructive of fundamental goods, and so you consider them political enemies. And so you need to act in light of that. And there's a whole body of literature, and it's actually a big controversy now within Christian circles over whether you can deceive and lie, and not lie, but whether you can essentially do a sort of non-lying deception, and how you would go about doing that without sinning. There's actually a deep literature on that going back into the Reformation period that's going to come out, I think, next year or so. So I think it's a very important topic, and it's actually not as obvious as you might think. So anyway, I don't want to get too much into that, but the point is that politics, in consequence of the definition, will have to deal with sin and everything that goes with that. All right, so the last thing I want to discuss is how does this relate to Christian politics? So all I've talked about is Christian politics. Now, we have to now apply the principle that grace does not destroy nature, but it perfects it, or restores and perfects it. Now, if that is the case, then everything I said before doesn't actually, then grace or the gospel doesn't actually change any of that. It doesn't affect any of that. It doesn't fundamentally change any of that, because grace does not destroy nature. Human nature as created, creational norms are still operative and necessary and fundamental to our life. That's why even Christian, if an entire nation is Christian, they still need some sort of system of governmental laws, and they still have social life, and they still participate in social hierarchies because they need that. In the same sense that there's still hierarchy in the home, there's still hierarchy in society. And so grace does not destroy nature, meaning that politics will remain. And so then what does Christianity then have to do with politics? Well, I would say centrally, the way grace operates in politics now is to inform what it means to be pious. You have to focus in on the pious side. The civil virtue side, that's mainly a matter of nature and human nature. So courage has not changed. The need to coordinate activity hasn't changed. But piety is now a matter of recognizing the true God, which was triune, and the only means to be reconciled to God and obtain eternal life and piety, through piety and worshiping God, is through Christ. And so grace informs that. And so the original duty of civil society, of society to mutually come together. Remember, society is coming together not only for earthly things, but also for things of piety, to live a life of godliness, quiet godliness, right? Well, how do you live a life of quiet godliness? Well, you have to recognize the true God. He can't be can't be polytheistic. You can't be an atheist, obviously. And so to be pious, you have to recognize those things. And so that in politics, a Christian politics is politics recognizing that that eternal life is the highest good, and that's attained through Christ. And so if society in general is intended to be a society in which aids each other in the pursuit of all goods, including the highest good, which is eternal life, then the communicating, the contributing, the precepts, the customs, the laws, all those should then, in their totality, orient you to eternal life. If you've read my book, you've kind of already heard all this stuff before, but that's where I get this. Like people say like weird stuff like, oh, it's from the 19th century, but a lot of my thinking on like the totality and these other things and my definition of Christian nationalism is actually very much reflected in, it's this book right here, me thinking through this book I'm talking through it right now. So the idea then is that all of our life here, we don't want to sacrifice what's earthly, and we still have to have good families and a good society and good secular vocations and all that. But the Christian element then says, wait, the highest good, everything society should point to this highest good without sacrificing all the other goods. And so there's different ways to do that. I mean, in customs and in traditions and through law, of course, you can have Sabbath laws and other laws. And those will be different in different places, of course. But that's what makes a Christian. It's the public recognition that the good of eternal life is attained through faith in Christ. And so you wouldn't then, of course, you cannot force people through law and custom or anything outward to become a Christian, have faith in Christ. But you can create the best outward conditions that conduce to that. So just like we do that in the home with our children, the same would be true for civil society. All right. Yeah. So that's Christian politics. That's the definition. So really, and the final thing I'll say is, in the end, Christian politics is not fundamentally different than just politics itself. Grace in a way reorients the society to the things of grace without undermining or destroying any other element of that, fundamental natural element of that. All right. So that'll conclude my discussion of definition. So thank you for listening.